afternoon to everyone. I'm Jeff Altschul, and I am giving the second in the Knowledge Series lectures for the Society for American Archaeology. And today I'm going to talk about cultural heritage management in developing countries. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about cultural heritage management and what exactly are developing countries. I'm going to talk about cultural heritage, how I think about it, what are the threats to cultural heritage, the safeguards that protect cultural heritage, various ways of dealing with cultural heritage management or CHM in the developing world. I'm going to give a case study of Mongolia. I'm going to talk a little bit about social advocacy, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what opportunities may exist in cultural heritage management. Okay, so let's start with what are developing countries? Well, the World Bank defines developing countries as those where the gross national income per capita is less than $12,735. So there are 135 of them around the world. You can see them distributed throughout Latin America, Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe. They are poor countries, and all of them need help in economic development. And so they can apply for different types of assistance from different institutions, including the development banks. Now, the way I think about it, and I think that often happens in each of these countries, all the countries that were on that map desperately need investment, and investment they cannot afford. And so they rely on the developed countries subsidizing their development. And the way they do that is they open their countries, they open their resources, their mineral resources, their natural resources, to both private and public enterprises. And the whole idea is that in exchange for that access, in exchange for putting up real estate and allowing different groups to come in, that the well-being of their citizens, of their country, will increase. Well, that's the premise. And in the countries that I've worked in, it is generally something they accept but they accept it in a very skeptical way. That is, they expect, or there is an expectation that, these are not philanthropists, these are not companies coming in to just do good. They're there to extract resources, and there's a price to that. And the concern voiced to me by people at all levels in developing countries, national, local, provincial, down to the individual farmer or herder, is that they're not making off real well on this bargain. That the multinationals are doing extremely well. There are people in the government, the powerful, are doing extremely well. And they get sort of the crumbs of economic development. So that they not only don't get the best part of development, they also get disproportionately the costs of development. And that's a concern. And one way that communities confront that is, this is their land. This is how they view it. It's their resources. It is a certain, particularly for local communities, their identity is wrapped up into their ownership or their rights to certain things, and they feel they're being usurped. And often what we find in economic development situations is that heritage gets social identity, and it is the way in which the expression of concern that these communities are able to bring to the fore. So they confront these development opportunities in ways that, in different ways, but they use their past to say, look, this is us, this is who we are, these are our things, and if you want to come in here, these are the things we want. And so they use their past not simply to stop things, stop reservoirs or stop dams, but to try and elicit certain things that will better their communities in ways that are consistent with their values. And so that brings us to cultural heritage. And to me, cultural heritage is really simple. It's whatever the local communities think it is. And so it is a way in which people say, this is who we are. This is how we are to behave. And these are the things our children and our children's children need to know to keep our group alive. And cultural heritage management, which is what I do and what other people around the world do, is to listen really carefully. And if we're good at it, we try to listen very carefully, identify those aspects of a community's life that are critically important to them, and then come up with ways in which those can be preserved and sustained into the future. And you'll notice that I talk about heritage not as something that's static. It's not an old building or an archaeological site, although that can be parts of them. But heritage is generally a negotiation about who people think they are and what's important to them. And it's generally when you go into a community, at least in my experience, and you ask them, we ask them the wrong questions often. We ask them, where are your archaeological sites? And they look at us and they go, well, we don't know and we don't really care. But if you ask them about what's important to them, that elicits a discussion, which indeed might end up, often does, with a discussion of where are the places of importance to them, which could include archaeological sites or ancestral sites or old buildings or whatever it is, battlegrounds, so on and so forth. So heritage generally emerges through a negotiation or discussions with local communities, with project sponsors, with governments, and with heritage experts. So everybody is part of this process. And that leads me to a sort of a discussion, or at least an aside, because often in discussions about cultural heritage, there's a distinction made between tangible heritage and intangible heritage. And to me, that's really not terribly helpful. People say, banks, for example, or a proponent will say, we need to tick these boxes in order to get our permit or to get a loan or to do something. And so one of the boxes is, did you find or did you identify important heritage sites? Well, okay, and so they send in archaeologists or architect historians to identify things. And then there's another question about, did you ask the local communities about aspects that are important to them that could be impacted? And then anthropologists or some other social scientists will go in and talk to them about uh, the economy, their crafts, their things that will be, their land if they're going to be resettlement issues. And they're separated so that, and that creates two things happen. One is it doesn't allow for that discussion to emerge about what's important to people. They're put into boxes, and so they're asked specific questions without being empowered to be part of the discussion. And then the second thing to me is that it privileges a European, North American point of view on things, so that archaeological sites are important as scientific objects, historic buildings as architectural features, as opposed to social features where people congregate. And so it privileges a scientific view over a perhaps indigenous view or community view. And so the way things are treated, whether they're excavated or restored, tends to be the way heritage is dealt with, as opposed to perhaps different ways in which the community might think about. So in general, I think this is a not terribly productive way to think about heritage as divided between tangible and intangible. I'm going to talk a little bit about what protects heritage, what right now. And the truth is, there are lots of things, lots of laws and conventions and regulations protecting cultural heritage. They occur on the site level. You can be on the World Heritage List, or on a government, on a country level list, or even a city level list. There are laws in most of the developing countries I've worked in. There are laws protecting cultural heritage. They say that you're not supposed to destroy things when you develop. And then there are all sorts of international conventions and charters, and the multilateral financial institutions, which called development banks, the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation. All of those have safeguards about cultural heritage. And so I have been asked when I was president of the SAA, development banks, when I went to see them, at first were somewhat surprised, and they said, "Why are you here? I mean, you have all cultural heritage is protected better than almost any other environmental and social safeguard. There are tons of things protecting it." Well, there's lots of paper protecting them. The problem is that they don't seem to work very well. And so those safeguards don't seem to live up to the promise that of the words in them. And so cultural heritage, I think, in many places is viewed as something that's endangered and generally given up when issues of development come forward. Now, in my mind, there are sort of two ways that most developing countries think about cultural heritage management. That is, the process in which they put in place to identify and protect things. The first is I term a social license. And it's generally when a project proponent goes into a local community and says, we want to put up something, real estate development or a mine or a reservoir, whatever it is. And they ask the local community's permission. May not be quite that formal, but they'll say, this is what we intend to do. What do you all think about it? And they need to have the local community accept that this is going to happen, and the local community often benefits in some ways from these things. So they are interested, but they also are concerned about other aspects of it, like how it's going to affect their environment, how it's going, if they're resettling people, how is that going to affect the community? And so, it's that bargain I mentioned early on. Economic development is for the benefit of everybody, but certain people have to, bear the brunt of it. And so a social license is a project proponent obtaining permissions to proceed. And that includes dealing with their cultural heritage. A second way that I think about it, I called it national patrimony. There are certain governments, certain countries in which cultural heritage is so vital to the interest of the identity of that country that they view it as a responsibility of the government. It's national patrimony. It's not for sale. It's not okay for a multinational company based in a developed world to come in and decide for this particular country what's important and what should be done. And so the government doesn't, or to hire a consultant to do that. The government needs to take control of that. And generally, this is a governmental approach to cultural heritage management, so that the government is the agent deciding what's important and also doing it. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about each one of these. The social license approach is often correlated or associated with what's known as the polluter pays principle. And that's simply where the proponent is responsible, and therefore the proponent must pay for the identification of cultural heritage, the evaluation of what's important, and ultimately whatever is decided in terms of mitigation or treatment of those things. And it's very attractive because, after all, government doesn't cost the government anything. It's placed onto the burden is placed on the proponent. And there are lots of people who think this is the right way to go. After all, they're benefiting from access to certain mineral rights or whatever it is, and therefore they should pay for it. And it's not just in the developing world. This is probably the most common way of how we deal with cultural heritage throughout the world. And the real problem with the polluter pays principle approach is the sense that the people with the least or the most economic incentive to do the least amount of work are the ones responsible. So the person or company or government even that really is going to benefit by not doing very much is indeed the one that is contracting for the work and making sure the work is done. And in the United States, we used to call this the race to the bottom, a sense that if there are no controls, then if nobody's pushing back against it, then you'll get the least amount done, the poorest standards, and the worst preservation result. And so, to many, the national patrimony approach is very attractive because the archaeological sites are not for sale. They're not to go to the least bidder. The government is responsible and determines what is appropriate to be done in terms of finding things and treating them. And the government has to allocate funds to do that. Often they get funds from the proponent, but ultimately these are government funds. And in most cases that I'm aware of, the government also does the work. So the Institute of Archaeology in many countries, or the Ministry of Culture, has an arm that does the work and determines if it is done appropriately. And so it is, I think, rightfully characterized as a monopoly. The government, usually a government agency, is responsible for determining whether cultural heritage is at risk, to identify that cultural heritage, to decide what to do, and to do it. And so one of the problems in this approach often is that there's just no accountability. Local communities have absolutely no say in, or can have no say in how much is done or what is determined important or any of those things. And even though this is designed to make sure that cultural heritage is dealt appropriately, this approach is at least as susceptible to corruption and the desires of the powerful as a social license approach. If the government really wants a reservoir, it can and often does put a lot of pressure on ministries of culture not to find a whole lot. In fact, as I'll discuss later, they may not even ask the Ministry of Culture to do anything. And so it's one of those things where it can work really well, but there are issues that are structurally in the way, or can be in the way. Well, for me, either way you do it, social license or national patrimony or some combination of the two, there are four aspects that I think are critical for any management structure. One is that it has adequate resources. You have to have the ability to find out what is important. You need to empower the local community to make sure that they feel they are incorporated and they have a stake and they are being taken seriously, and that they are willing to disclose information in a way that it will be safeguarded and that it'll be dealt with appropriately. And you also need strong government regulation. I mean, as I said, there is a race to the bottom unless you have some sort of pushback. And so if the government sets the standards of what the quality of the work is, then that is the standard at which you should expect project proponents who really who are viewing this as viewing cultural heritage often as an impediment to meet. So the stronger the standard, they'll just meet it. And then for me, I think there has to be some sort of independent verification. This is often missing in developing countries. It's, often the World Bank, for example, will put off to the applicant, to the country trying to apply for a loan, the responsibility of identifying cultural heritage. And if that country comes back and says, yeah, we're okay, there's nothing here, the World Bank generally does not question it. And I'm not trying to pick on the World Bank. That's true of other agencies and other funding agencies. We don't do this enough. And I think it's actually a role the SAA can play and others can play. That is, particularly in a national patrimony sort of viewpoint, if the government is both regulating the process and doing the work. So they are deciding what work is done, they're doing the work, and then they're deciding if the work was done adequately. That leads to all sorts of problems. So some sort of independent verification is critical. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study. and this is from Mongolia. It is Mongolia. If I get my pointer here, here's Russia, here's China. Mongolia is squeezed into the middle. It was a Soviet satellite until the early 1990s when it became independent. It is very large and sparsely populated. It has 3 million people in an area the size of the United States west of the Mississippi. It is traditionally the home of nomadic herders. And it is a very proud country. And recently it has, well, not actually recently, since the Bronze Age, people have known about minerals in Mongolia. But since independence, and since industrial mining has taken a look at Mongolia, there's been a tremendous uptick in interest in mineral resources in Mongolia. And one in particular, the Oyu Tolgoi mine, is 60 kilometers. It's over here, and this is the South Gobi province. It is 60 kilometers from China, and it is the largest undeveloped gold copper deposit in the world. And so I was part of a team called the Mongolian International Heritage Team that was contracted to develop a cultural heritage program for the South Gobi province, which could then be used in other provinces in Mongolia. So we were designing something for an area of intense mining that could then be mimicked in the other, in the rest of the country. And essentially, it was fairly simple. We wanted to know what people thought should be protected and conserved, and what was critically important to them, so that their culture could survive. Designed a program to do that, and we tried to think hard about a regulatory process that would work in Mongolia and be sustainable financially. And so I should add that the International Heritage Team consisted of the Mongolian Academy of Sciences, University of Arizona, and Statistical Research, the company I'm associated with. But it was the work was done mostly by Mongolians. And why did it come about? I think the interesting thing about the Cultural Heritage Program in Mongolia was that prior to the mine, they did a lot of public consultation, and they went out to the herdsmen and they went out to the local communities, and they asked, what is it you want from mining, from economic development? And they received a lot of information. They wanted jobs, they wanted health care, they wanted better education, they wanted a better future for their people, and they wanted their culture preserved, and not necessarily in that order. Cultural heritage ranked very high. And it was interesting when we did meetings, and we did scores of meetings throughout the South Gobi, and they viewed, we talked a lot about what were the threats. What did they view the threats to their communities and cultural heritage? And, they're listed there, but the loss of their life way, of being nomads, the destruction of their ancestral places, loss of customs, their loss of the language. There's a specific dialect in the South Gobi that they felt would be basically turned into Chinese. And so they were very concerned about these things. But they also recognized there were a lot of opportunities in economic development. They would learn where a lot of places were. They were very excited. The professionals were extremely excited because, like in many developing countries, if you're an archaeologist, you work on projects that expatriates, like those from the United States or Japan or Korea or Russia come in with grant money, and they determine where to do the research, and they allow you to work with them. And so this was an opportunity to get the mining companies to put into a fund so that Mongolians could direct their own research. And this was incredibly important to them. And they also listed things like getting more World Heritage Sites, new crafts, improving the culture centers, integrating their local cultural heritage into public schools, and developing better museums. They viewed mining as an opportunity to do all of that. And so for me, and I think for my team members, the cultural heritage program wasn't so much about finding places and protecting things as it was about a process to think through how you do that, how Mongolians can determine what was important to them and to protect that. And so to me it was, and I think in the end it became much more about those kinds of questions as opposed to going into communities and saying, gee, where's your heritage? Where is it located? What does it look like? Actually, we did that, or we spent a year or so doing ethnographic surveys and archaeological studies, but in the end, much of this revolved around how do we think about these kinds of issues. I'm not going to go into a lot of what ended up being, but there were a couple of important things. One was, like in many developing countries, in Mongolia, they had a national patrimony system in which the Institute of Archaeology was the judge, jury, and executioner. They decided what was to be done, they did it, and they decided if they did it well. And we immediately separated that into different government ministries so that the people deciding what was to be done was not the same as the people that did it, and that there would be independent verification. The other thing we did is that, as I mentioned, the law of cultural heritage had 3% compliance. The law was amended, so there's 100% compliance. The other aspect was to create a cultural heritage cannot be in a polluter pays world. You only do cultural heritage in the areas you impact, but that's very difficult when the community is identifying cultural heritage that goes beyond those fence lines, like language and dress and camel festivals and things like that. And so instead of focusing on the actual area, what they ended up deciding was to create a cultural heritage fee for each mining license, and to have that fee be protected from other government agencies, and to fund a cultural heritage center in South Gobi province that would then be responsible for deciding what was to be done and how to do it. As I mentioned, we changed the law, or they changed the law, they amended the law, and they changed the law of minerals so that it says you have to comply with this law. Much of, in the developing country, any cultural heritage program has to talk about training. There just are not enough professionals, but it's not just the professionals. You also need people who are going to work at local communities, and you need teachers, and you need a whole set of skills that are not necessarily university-based. And, frankly, you need to understand that the local communities are not going to be, have degrees in anthropology or archaeology or whatever it is. And that you need to have trainings that will provide them with the information they need to be successful in running a village community center or culture center. And then we set in motion a way of having local community input, called it the Standards of Acceptable Culture Change. And what it is a group, a diverse group within the communities that will then define what it is that is critically important to them, measure whether or not those things are changing at acceptable rates, and then coming up with revising programs or reallocating funds from this cultural heritage fees to make sure that they view that the cultural preservation and stewardship is going in the right direction. We did write a bunch of reports, both in Mongolian and English, which are available on the web. And because this will be a podcast, you can, if you don't copy them down, it's not that important. You can get this off the SAA website and get to them that way. So, in essence, can we define, will the CHP work in other areas? Well, sure. Of course it'll work if everybody wants it to work. And, I'm talking about all the players. One of the interesting things, again, in Mongolia on that cultural heritage fee was we knew how much it cost to run the Gobi Cultural Heritage Center every year. And we sort of worked backwards and said, how many people does it have to employ? What does it have to do? What are the kinds of activities? What's the staffing level? What's the bricks and mortar cost? And then we just went to the mining companies and said, we really don't care how you come up with this number, but this is the number we need each year. And you can base it on tonnage, you can base it on person hours, you can base it on the type of permit, the type of license. But you guys figure out how you're going to tax yourselves. And if that has been they were part of the process. That's what I'm trying to get at. And I think that was very helpful. Well, and I found that part of this was that last year we had the SAA sponsored a meeting in Lima where we brought in the representatives from the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the Inter-American Development Bank, and ministries of culture from 9 Latin American countries. And what we heard was regardless of whether it was a social license-based polluter pays model or a national patrimony government-based model, what we heard was that the banks are requiring the loan applicants, whether they be private companies or governments, to guarantee the safeguards, and that they are assuming that the governments will follow the process correctly. And so they will ask the Ministry of Culture if they have any concerns, and if not, how much money do they need to go out and do surveys and define what is important for local peoples and so on and so forth. And what we learned was that local governments were not necessarily that interested in doing that. Different countries have different ideas, and if cultural heritage isn't made explicit in terms of something important, the thing falls apart. And that brings me to the issue of the government may think it falls apart, but in my experience, the local communities view cultural heritage as something very important to them. I've never been to a place where they don't. And so the question is, how do we get these communities to be heard by their own governments to be taken seriously? And that becomes the role of social advocacy. And it's different in different parts of the world, but if you view that heritage is a critical component of how a group views itself, then one of the ways in which development questions for a country become important is empowering those groups to be able to have their say. And so cultural heritage is not simply about going to a community and saying, gee, what are the things that are important about your past that you want preserved? It's about allowing them to use their cultural heritage as an entree and a discussion point in their future and in the discussions of economic development. And so cultural heritage specialists need to recognize that they have that whether they want it or not, they are part of this process. It's very difficult, in my opinion, it's almost impossible to stay away from that role, to somehow say, I'm not part of this decision or this emerging heritage, and that brings up all sorts of issues. The hallmark of the American Anthropological Association's ethical principles is do no harm. That it's been that way for 100 years since the association was founded, and it's a nice catchphrase. I think that in the beginning of anthropology, there were people who believed that was possible, or at least that was important. My point is that as I discussed in cultural heritage, since you're part of the process, that's not possible. It's not possible to be outside of the process. It's not possible not to be at some point an agent of social change. You're there discussing social change. You're there discussing something that will happen to a community. And to sit there and say, well, I'm really not, I'm simply there to elicit information. You're shaping by how you phrase questions, how you talk to people. You're phrasing very much those answers, or you're shaping them. But it's not that we don't want to do harm. We actually, no, we want to be part of this process, and we want to do good. We want to succeed in our careers by actually having good outcomes for people. But of course, how do you define the social good? So that's always contextual. It's always it depends on your perspective of what is the social good and who's responsible. Did anyone ask you your opinion about whether a dam should go on the Amazon and replace people? Well, generally speaking, that is not something that a cultural heritage expert is sent into a community to shape. But you go into context with certain political ideas about things, and you need to understand your role in terms of, no, you're not there to push public policy, but you are there to ensure that those who have a part in that process of decision get heard. And it's a very fine line. And then how do you achieve that in a free market? These are questions. I'm not trying to answer these questions. These are questions all cultural heritage experts, specialists deal with, and they struggle with. These are ethical questions. And for me, as you go through a career, how you answer these questions change. So you just need to be aware that you are indeed there as an agent of, you are part of this process. Well, I am getting near the end here, and I wanted to talk a little bit about cultural heritage management as a career, particularly for those who are students listening and at the beginning parts of their career. I would say this, having been in cultural heritage management for 40 years, I think there's more opportunity now in the field than ever before, and that's certainly true in developing countries. And for those in developing countries, you are now in a position to have a very different role in terms of actually being in charge of your country's or your community's heritage and the way people think about it, as opposed to being dependent on grant money from outside. So it's a very exciting time, and there are various ways you can engage in this. There are government jobs, there's working for NGOs, there's doing what I do, which is consulting, being contracted by folks to do stuff. And then there's, of course, working for mining companies or agencies, aid agencies, banks, things like that. So there's a whole array of ways of engaging. The other thing I would say is that the potential to do good in developing countries is just phenomenal. I mean, many countries I work in are at such a rudimentary or fundamental level, that a base level, that your energy, you will see the results of your energy, as opposed to how many of my colleagues feel in developed countries or industrial countries, where these processes have been going on for a long time, and it often feels very bureaucratic. To do cultural heritage management. Developing countries, like that's not generally the case. And it is, in my experience, local communities are tremendously receptive to help in thinking about issues of social identity, social justice, issues of development, how to allow economic development and maintain who they are. These are all things that are critically important. I don't want anyone to think I'm against economic development. The World Bank is there to eradicate poverty. It's a very good mission. I sometimes question some of its methods, but I don't think that's a bad thing to do. And I think the developing countries desperately need that investment. They just need it in a way that's consistent with their values. I won't kid anybody. This is a career that is will be full of frustration. That is, there will be many obstacles placed in the way. There's no guaranteed funding. There's no this. There's no that. It will be constructing processes and agencies out of whole cloth. But I can't guarantee anything. But I would say that someone investing their career in this arena, that you look back on it 20, 30, 40 years from now, and my guess is it will have been a very interesting career, very exciting at times, and very rewarding. It is definitely a non-traditional path. Even in my own little career, I've traveled. I started at Teotihuacan, at the Teotihuacan Mapping Project, very straight academic research program, and was trained to go into academia. And I, for a variety of reasons, didn't do that. And it was very long, and the path at the time and when I started was not as clear cut as it appears today. But it was very exciting, and it was very rewarding. It's very hard to get trained in it, in the sense of, since you don't know what you're going to be doing, I wouldn't worry too much about things like, what courses to take, or did my training prepare me for this? Probably not. But I think it can give you a good foundation. It can give you a good set of peers. It can give you a good set of, a moral compass by which to make decisions. And so I think a non-traditional path is, maybe it's not as secure. It may be seen as somewhat more risky, but I think for those who take it, you'll find it very, at the end of the day, something that you can be very proud of. I want to thank you for this talk. I think we are done just a little bit ahead of time, which is good. I didn't drone on too long. I just want to reiterate that this has been recorded. There is a podcast available on the SAA website. So if you want to review the PowerPoint, or you want to listen to, or let someone else listen to it, it's all available. If you have any questions for me, I know this is not the venue by which there's a lot of interaction, but please contact me. My email address was on the opening slide, but you can also contact me through the SAA website. Just send an email to the office, and it will get to me. I wish you all the very best, and for those of you interested in cultural heritage, I think you will find it a rich and rewarding career. Thank you. Good afternoon.